Hello everyone and welcome to OmahaPokerTraining.com. Maybe this is the first video you're watching on our site. Maybe you've never even played the game of Pot Limit Omaha before. My name is Steve Blay. I'm the founder of AdvancedPokerTraining.com, the world's #1 poker training site. Since 2009, that site has had over 50,000 members from 175 different countries. You can learn more about me on our coaches page, but right now I want to talk about Pot Limit Omaha. Let's face it, right now the biggest tournaments are still No Limit Hold'em. No Limit Hold'em is a great game, but there are many reasons to love PLO. The people who play PLO in local card rooms play really bad. They play too many hands, they go too far with those hands, and they build big, juicy pots. And if there's a better reason to love Pot Limit Omaha, I don't know what it is. Now, everything you know from No Limit Hold'em about how to play poker in a card room, those same rules are going to apply to Pot Limit Omaha. The things you know about posting the blinds, betting in turn, the ranking of hands are the same. All that stuff is going to help you to be able to play Pot Limit Omaha the first time you go to a card room. But there are going to be two differences in the rules. Number one, you're going to get dealt 4 cards instead of 2 cards, and you're going to have to use exactly 2 of your whole cards, no more, no less, in making your final hand. And that can get a little tricky, and the first few times you play the game, you're going to end up getting it wrong. You're going to think you have a flush when you don't have a flush and things like that. That's why Omaha Poker Training is so great, because you can make these mistakes on OPT before you go to the card room and lose actual money making those mistakes. And it's really embarrassing when you go to a card room and you misread your hand and think you have a flush when you don't actually have one. The second rule difference is that Pot Limit Omaha, as the name says, is played pot limit, not no limit. So unlike in No Limit Hold'em, where you can just bet all your chips anytime you want, in Pot Limit Omaha you can only bet the size of the pot. And it can be a little tricky sometimes figuring out exactly what the maximum bet size is. And I'm going to go through some examples of that in this video. So let's jump right into it now. Okay, so let's start here looking at the similarities. Again, as I said, pretty much everything is going to be a similarity except for a few small differences. In every hand, there's going to be a small and a big blind. There's 5 community cards like you're used to, 3 cards on the flop, 1 card on the turn, 1 card on the river. There's an opportunity to bet pre-flop and then on each street, just like in No Limit Hold'em. And the hand order is the same, from just having nothing but a high card all the way up to a royal flush. Now let's take a look at the differences. Each player is dealt 4 whole cards instead of 2, and you must use exactly 2 of your whole cards to make your hand. And along with that, of course, then you have to use exactly 3 of the board cards to make your hand. Now you might look at this and you might say, well, the average winning hand in PLO is not going to be much better than it is in No Limit Hold'em, because you're only getting 4 cards instead of 2. That's not that big a difference. But when you really think about it, there are 6 different combinations of 2 cards you could play to make your hand. You can work that out if you take 4 cards out of a deck and work out how many different combinations of 2 cards there are in there. There's actually 6 different combinations. So the average winning hand in PLO is much higher than it is in Hold'em. So often people are winning with not just straights or flushes, but even the best full house to quads, things like that. So it takes a much better hand to win the pot in PLO than it does in Hold'em. Finally, betting is limited to the size of the pot, and we will talk more about that in just a minute here. So let's move on here and let's look at an example of why it's sometimes difficult to tell exactly what hand you have when you have to play exactly 2 of your whole cards. One of the most obvious examples is if you just hold 1 card of a suit, like the Ace of Hearts, there is no way to make a flush with just 1 heart in your hand. Even if there's 4 hearts on the board, you do not have a flush because you have to always play 2 cards from your hand. So there's an example of a common mistake the beginners make. They think they have a flush because they see 4 or even 5 of a suit on the board and they only have 1 or maybe none of those in their hand. And you always have to play 2 cards from your hand. Looking at the example actually on this slide here, so as we can see there are trip 3s on the board. So the first question we're asking is, does this player over here have a full house? And the answer is no. It kind of looks like they do because they've got a queen there, and so it looks like they could make threes full of queens, but there is no way they can play all three of those threes on the board along with the queen on the board, because they can only play 3 cards from the board. So in fact, you need to have a pocket pair in order to make a full house using those 3 trays on the board there. So that player there does not have a full house. Now let's look at the player below there. Does the player below them, do they have a full house? No, they do not also. It looks again like maybe they could have made 3s full of 9s, but they cannot. How about a flush? They've got 3 hearts in their hand. There's 2 hearts on the board. 3 plus 2 makes 5. It looks like maybe they have a flush. No, they do not have a flush. They have to use exactly 2 cards from their hand and 3 from the board. Let's move on to the next player at the bottom here. Does that player have a full house? The answer is yes, they do. They have 3s full of kings. Okay, that's a pretty easy one. Now let's take a look at the last player here. The question we're asking here is, does this player have a boat? The answer is yes, but it's not what we might initially think it is. They do not have 3s full of queens. They only have 3s full of 10s. Now, is that the best hand they can make, though? If you were paying attention, you're right. It is not the best hand they could make. In this case, they actually could make quad 3s by using the 3 3s on the board, the 1 from their hand, and then also the queen from their hand. So they've got 4 trays with a queen kicker is the best hand they could actually make. All right, so hopefully after that, you've gotten an idea of how difficult it can be sometimes to actually read your hand. That being said, you'll pick it up really quickly. You're going to make a mistake a few times. The nice thing is, as I've said here on Omaha Poker Training, you can practice so you don't mess up when you actually go to a casino. And whenever there's a showdown on our site, the software will highlight the 2 cards in the winning hand that were used in their whole cards and the 3 cards from the board that were used, so you can see what the winning hand was and how it was constructed. So let's talk about pot limit bets. So as I said before, in Pot Limit Omaha, you cannot just go all in anytime you want. You are limited to betting what the size of the pot is, but there's a lot of confusion over exactly how you calculate how much you're allowed to bet. People have different ideas on what the easiest way to compute that is. I'm going to tell you the way I personally use. I'm also going to give you one other way that I've heard a lot of people use. I promise it will become second nature really soon, but at the start it can be a little confusing when you're trying to figure out exactly how much you can bet. So the way I look at it is this. I look at the amount in the pot when the action gets to me, how much there would be in the pot if I had called, and then I can raise that total amount. So I actually pretend I'm going to call, then I count up how much would be in the pot if I had called. That's how much I can raise on top of my call. Let me say that one more time. I pretend I was going to call. I add up how much would be in the pot if I had called. That's how much I can raise on top of my call. So let's look at some examples here. So here's an example from a 1-2 game, $1 small blind, $2 big blind. So it gets to the under the gun player. He could limp, of course, for $2 if he wants, or he could raise to $7, a maximum of $7, or anything in between. Why can he raise to $7 maximum? Well, if he were to call, let's pretend he were to call, that would put $5 in the pot. So he can raise $5 on top of his initial $2 call. 5 plus 2 is $7. So let's assume they raise to $7. Now we get to the next player under the gun plus 1. He could fold, he could call $7. What would be the maximum he could raise up to, though? Well, using the same method as before, let's pretend he did call. That would put a total of $17 in the pot if you work that out. So that means he can raise $17 additional on top of the amount he would have put in if he had called. 17 plus 7 is $24. So he could raise to a maximum of $24. Let's suppose he didn't do that, though. Let's suppose the under the gun plus 1 player only called the $7. What would be the most the under the gun plus 2 player could raise to? Well, same method again. Let's suppose under the gun plus 2 only called. That would be 7 plus 7 plus 7 plus 1 plus 2. That would be a total of $24 in the pot. That means he can raise $24 on top of the initial $7 it would cost him to call. 24 plus 7 is 31. Let's look at another example here. This one from a 2-5 pot limit Omaha game, and we're going to assume there was $15 in the pot pre-flop. Let's assume the under the gun player limped, the small blind completed, and the big blind just checked, okay? We go to the flop. It's on the small blind first. Let's suppose the small blind opens for $10. There's now $25 in the pot. Now it gets to the big blind. He wants to raise pot. How much can he bet? Well, let's assume he called, as we're using the same method every time. Pretending he called, he would put $10 in that would have made $35 in the pot. So he is allowed to raise $35 additionally on top of that $10 call. 35 plus 10 is 45. He's allowed to raise to a maximum of $45. Let's say he does that, and now we get to the under the gun player. How much could the under the gun player raise to if he or she really had a monster hand? Okay, there's already $70 in the pot. When it gets to them, it would cost them $45 to call, so we pretend that he called. That would put $115 in the pot. Therefore, they're allowed to raise $115 on top of that $45 call they could have made. 115 plus 45 is 160. They could raise to $160. Now, if I lost you at any point there's a couple other ways you can do this. One way some friends of mine like to do this is they multiply 3 times the previous bet and then add what was in the pot before that bet. So here's an example of that. Let's say there was $30 in the pot going to the flop and someone opened for $20. 3 times $20 is 60, plus the original 30 was in the pot, makes $90. Let's go back to the previous slide again, and we'll use the method that I just talked about. So the big blind is facing a bet of $10. 3 times $10 is 30, plus there was $15 in the pot before that bet was made. 30 plus 15 is 45. You see, we get the same answer. So some people like to use the 3 times the previous bet plus what was in the pot before that bet method, and that's fine if you like to do it that way. If you're still confused, do not worry, because you will get this really quickly. On OmahaPokerTraining.com, there's always a pot button you can press, so you can try to work out the math on your head, and then you can press the pot button, and it will tell you what is the maximum size you're allowed to bet, and I promise you're going to pick it up really fast. The other thing you can do if you're in an actual card room is you can say, I bet the pot, to the dealer, and the dealer will determine the size of a pot size bet for you. Now that's something they will not do for you in No Limit Hold'em, but in PLO, they will actually count the pot for you and tell you how much a pot size bet is. If you were to announce in No Limit Hold'em, I bet the pot, the dealer would say, I'm sorry, that's an illegal bet. But in Pot Limit Omaha, you can actually say, I bet the pot, and they will tell you how much is legal for you to bet. Okay, I hope that all was helpful. Thanks for being a member of OmahaPokerTraining.com. If you don't have one yet, be sure to get your All Access Pass so you have access to all the great features, and I will talk to you again soon in my next video.